you all for being here for another Masters Series evening in the Peristyle. I'm delighted to welcome you all, in particular to welcome Mr. Deke Wells and the board of the Toledo Museum of Art. We've just had a board meeting, and the Board of Trustees of this museum keeps us in very good stead. I'm delighted to welcome Will Owen and Harvey Wagner, who collected all of the works of art in this exhibition, and Will be giving a talk at 2 o'clock on Saturday in the galleries, and we'll do it as a two-hander with Will. So that should be fun at 2 o'clock on Saturday. But I want to thank Will and Harvey for all the work that they did in gathering this incredible collection, and then the extraordinary benefaction of giving the collection to Dartmouth College. And I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Michael Taylor, the director of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College here. Where's Michael? Here he is, right in front of me. Welcome, Michael. I'm pleased also to welcome Mr. Lindsay Smith, who, through the whole process of this exhibition, we have discovered married a Toledoan and is living here, but was a distinguished Australian diplomat for 30 years, including postings at the United Nations and in Fiji. I'm thrilled to welcome Katie Russell here, who is the Director of Engagement and Learning at the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, where I was a director, and she happens also to be the wife of Wally Caruana. And so we welcome them both here. And we want to pay particular tribute to our ambassadors. Toledo Museum of Art ambassadors have had a great role in this museum for a very long time. But in sponsoring the Masters Series, they've done something magnificent. So any ambassadors here present, I'd invite you to stand. So thank you to Cindy Rimlin and all the Toledo Museum of Art ambassadors for this great gift that you're giving us. Now, Wally Caruana is a wonderful person, as a great curator and a very distinguished expert on Aboriginal art. Wally was senior curator at the National Gallery when I arrived in 1997, and he'd been involved with the gallery before, in fact, it was built. While there were still warehouses within Canberra full of works of art to go into the new building. And from 1984 right through 2001, so halfway through my time, Wally was senior curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the National Gallery of Australia. And he really oversaw the development of what is the most important collection of Indigenous art in the world. Some, I believe, 8,000 works now today. And he curated many exhibitions, extraordinary exhibitions, including the Aboriginal Memorial, which is the signature work really of Aboriginal art today, which had been shown also at the Sydney Biennale in 1988, the bicentennial year of Australia. He curated Aboriginal art, the continuing tradition, in 1989. Roads Cross, the paintings of Rover Thomas in 1994. And then the exhibition that introduced my time, my first exhibition there, which was opened by Sir William Deane, the Governor-General of Australia. The Painters of the Wagner Sisters story. This was a tradition of a particular story, which we have in our exhibition, courtesy of Will and Harvey, over 7 decades and 4 generations. It was an amazing show. And then we had the World of Dreamings, when we brought the Aboriginal Memorial and many other works to the State Hermitage Museum, where the exhibition was shown in the year 2000 in the Nikolai Hall, the throne room of the Tsars in St. Petersburg, and then came back to the National Gallery in Canberra. And Wally all the time has been writing, publishing books, many books, and today he's a visiting fellow at the Department of Art History in the Australian National University in Canberra. He was the senior consultant for Aboriginal art to Sotheby's, and is the business partner with Michael Reid in Caruana and Reid Fine Art. Very recently he curated the other big show of Aboriginal art that's happened in America. He co-curated it, which is called Ancestral Modern, and we had Bob Kaplan with us at the opening of our show, and Bob and his wife Margaret Levy made an extraordinary collection of which they've given 100 works and more to the Seattle Art Museum. And Wally, most recently of all, has curated a show at the Drill Hall Gallery in the Australian National University in Canberra. I just want to briefly quote Will. Will, in a recent blog in late March of this year, Will Owen has a blog, you can Google it, it's fantastic. And he wrote about the third edition of Wally's book, Aboriginal Art, which you can buy in our store. We have signed copies there for you, signed by Wally today. And the third edition was produced just last year. And Will wrote, the first edition of the monograph appeared 20 years ago in 1993, and was one of the first full-length studies of the movement that I, Will, read. It's quite literally occupied a special place on the shelves of my art book collection over intervening years. Caruana's book is primarily geographical in its organisation. It's the first place I turn to orient myself in the literature. It's a starting point for citations to other studies, and it's a source to check a fact or a date quickly. But furthermore, I suspect that one reason that Caruana's book, Will wrote, was so crucial to shaping my perceptions of Aboriginal art is that he has an extraordinary gift of packing essential information into a concise, structured narrative that makes the discussion of any single work of art illuminating of the importance of the artwork and the artist, while also locating its significance in a larger historical context. Wally loves people. That's really, really important, and in the way that we've structured the presentation of Crossing Cultures here in Canberra, in Toledo, Ohio, in the Toledo Museum of Art, is to give you that idea that real people made these works of art, most of which have been made since the year 2000. Can I invite you to give the warmest, heartiest Toledo welcome to Wally Caruana.
Everybody, thank you, Brian, for such a kind and generous introduction. Before I start speaking, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Kickapoo and the Miami peoples. It's traditional in Australia that to acknowledge the traditional landowners whenever you speak about their art, and here I am speaking about Aboriginal art from Australia in Toledo. I'd also like to thank Brian not only for his kind words but for the invitation to come speak here today, and also to the ambassadors of the Toledo Art Museum. I'd also like to acknowledge the staff here who have been really helpful, very wonderful in fact, in helping us get here and prepare for this talk. And make a special mention of Harvey, Wagner and Will Owen for, apart from anything else, sharing their wonderful collections with the public in America. I think this is the most generous and important, I was going to say gesture, but it's actually more than just a gesture, it's a reality. And what I'm going to speak about this evening is the emergence of Aboriginal art in the public domain. Going back really about 100 years ago when it all first started. But just to give you an impression of where we're going to actually start from. This map I noticed Brian had organised a very similar one in the exhibition, so I hope it's not too redundant, but it gives you an idea of a relative scale of things. But I'm also going to make particular reference, because both Brian and I, as Brian said, had worked with the Indigenous collections at the National Gallery in Canberra, that the development of the collection there, in a sense, reflects how Aboriginal art has been received, promoted and appreciated over the years, both in Australia and abroad. What you're looking at there is a corridor in the storage rooms of the National Gallery in 1982. Now that's the year the gallery opened to the public, but it was actually being planned from the late 60s and throughout the 70s. And in those days, the idea was that the gallery would only collect a small number of Aboriginal works, exemplary or masterpieces, but that the responsibility for collecting Aboriginal art would fall to the National Museum of Australia, which is more a museum of social and cultural history. So there was a resistance to look at Aboriginal art as art. And so that corridor was intended to, in fact, store the entire collection that was going to be developed over the years. And this really stems from this notion stems from the very early days of colonialism, when the early settlers, the explorers who first went to Australia in the late 18th, early 19th century, thought that Aboriginal people were a people with no art, because they couldn't see for themselves what they consider to be traditionally art. In other words, rectangular pictures in frames and sculptures on pedestals. So things like what you're looking at there, which normally would be classified as artefacts and therefore utilitarian, were deemed to have no aesthetic value whatsoever. And the level of interest in Aboriginal art in those early days of last century can perhaps be exemplified by the surrealist map of the world, which you see in the top right of that slide, which was published in 1929. And you can see that Russia and Alaska, so that's part of America, that features quite prominently. Easter Island, in fact, also, Hilda Park features very well indeed, but Australia barely registers at all. I've also placed that map underneath there of the language map of Australia, which shows, in fact, each patch of colour, as some of you would probably know, represents this distinct language, as it was in 1788 when the British first settled Australia. There are over 600 languages and dialects spoken across the continent at that time. Sadly, probably only between 20 and 30 are spoken on a daily basis today. But if you were to include dialects, then you're looking at well over 50. So 1929 seemed to be an anomalous year in many ways because on the one hand, the world was ignoring Aboriginal Australia. And on the other hand, in the same year, we had the very first exhibition of bark paintings presented as art at the Museum of Victoria. And what you're looking at there at the top left is in fact the cover of the catalogue for that exhibition. The work in that show was put together by an anthropologist called Walter Baldwin Spencer. And even though he was an anthropologist, he was specifically interested in collecting bark paintings as art rather than as anthropology. So even in those early days, there was the beginning, if you like, of a different sort of appreciation of Aboriginal art, looking at the aesthetics of it rather than just the meaning and where it fitted into the social structure and cultural structures of Aboriginal people. But the effect that this exhibition had was to actually get people to understand that bark paintings were in fact a form of fine art. And that what they showed too is that it was the beginning, if you like, of serious anthropological interest in Aboriginal art. We still have this debate even today, nearly 100 years later, between whether we should be approaching Aboriginal art and interpreting from an anthropological view or from an artistic and aesthetic one. Well, that debate started a long time ago, and I think, especially the way crossing cultures has been shown here and at the Hood, that you can actually cross those divides too, because the work offers so much, it can be interpreted simultaneously in so many different ways. Donald Thompson, who took these photographs and collected this painting, and this is a painting from that exhibition that Brian just mentioned, the story of the Wagner sisters, was a prominent anthropologist but also a collector of art in the 30s. And one of the things that these anthropologists did, and the early collectors, was to actually show the connection of bark painting to other forms of Aboriginal art. So you can see a direct relationship between body painting and bark painting. And in a sense, what you're looking at there is, on the right-hand side, is a body painting, but painted on the skin of a tree rather than the skin of a person. And Aboriginal artists make this connection very strongly, and it is partly a reason why most bark paintings are actually displayed vertically rather than horizontally. That is, that sort of relationship with the individual, the human being, the artist, and also because the clan patterns themselves are a mark of identity. Those designs that are painted onto those young men's chests, which appear in the painting on the right as well. And another source of inspiration is rock painting and the painting of murals on the inside of bark shelters that Aboriginal people still make in many parts of Arnhem Land. And again, I've deliberately showed two works by an artist called Lachlan Bolmy, one of his rock paintings and one of his bark paintings. And the tradition of bark painting, people tend to talk in the past when they talk about Aboriginal art, but really they should be using the present tense. because activities like that still continue today. Now, in 1941, there was a major exhibition of Australian art that toured the US and Canada. Excuse me. Howard Morphy writes about it in the catalogue to Crossing Cultures. It was called Art of Australia, and it was curated by the director of the Yale University Art Gallery, Theodore Sizer. He was basically given a collection of Australian art to construct this exhibition, but he found a real problem with it because most of the art that was selected was by white artists. And just to paraphrase what he wrote in the report about the exhibition, was that the exhibition had a limitation, and that was that it consisted of paintings done between 1890 and 1914 that are factual, literal, and competent visual recordings but of little aesthetic merit and none of the intellectual. He said, so he decided to make the exhibition historical so he could include native art, as he said. And he said native art was immeasurably superior in artistic merit. So that appreciation happened that early on. In a review of the exhibition in the New York Times, headed From the Antipodes to Surrealism, the reviewer put three images together, and they are the three that appear on the top of this slide, and making some sort of equation between Aboriginal bark paintings and surrealist painting. It sort of shows you in some way that if you're not visually literate in a particular tradition, you're liable to make mistakes. For example, the painting on the left, which is also in the exhibition, was described in Time magazine as looking like a child's conception of Jean Harlow carrying an umbrella and a fan. Interesting, I thought. After the war, the anthropological interest in Aboriginal art continued apace, and one of the most important moments in that was the expedition to Arnhem Land, the American Australian Scientific Expedition to Arnhem Land in 1948. It was led by an ethnologist, C.P. Mountford. They collected something like over 600 bark paintings and sculptures, and they were eventually distributed to each of the major state public galleries in Australia, and a large group of those works was also sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I can't tell you if there's any of it's on display at the moment, but works from the collection have been on display over the years. Then the collection started to broaden out. Karel Kupka was an artist and an ethnographer from Paris. He was Czech French, and he first went to Australia in 1951. And for the next 20 years or so, he made a number of collections for European museums. And he was one of the very first to actually write about Aboriginal art from an aesthetic and artistic point of view rather than anthropological. But now we're moving towards the 60s. And there are a number of things that are impinging on Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal life at the time. The two main threats to Aboriginal culture were Christianity and mining. And Aboriginal people, I'm focusing on Arnhem Land for the time being, but right across the country were facing very uncertain futures. It wasn't that they necessarily objected to Christianity or to the missionaries, but they certainly didn't want to lose their culture with this new set of ideas coming to their communities. And some of those artists, even going back to the 1930s, some of the elders were talking about the fact that if we don't show Europeans our culture, we're going to lose it. And the best way of doing that is through showing them our paintings, because we can talk to them through our paintings. We can explain the depth and the profundity, and the relevance of our religion, and how it affects our relationship with the land, with country. So you had a number of very important events, and one of them happened in 1958 on an island north of Arnhem Land called Elcho Island, where the elders literally brought out a number of sacred objects used in ceremonies and put them on public display. This was something that had never been done before, but it showed, if you like, the seriousness of the situation. It wasn't that, again, the elders and the Aboriginal people on Elko were against Christianity, far from it, in the sense there was a syncretic movement to try and incorporate Christianity into their way of living, and hence you'll see a crucifix on the photograph on the right. But it was this desperate attempt to try and get Europeans to understand the importance of Aboriginal culture the way it was. And also in the exhibition, this has happened in Yirrkala community slightly to the east of Elko in the 1960s, and there are references made to it in Crossing Cultures. Firstly, you had mining interests in threatening the country on northeast Arnhem Land, and it went to what I suppose was the first land rights case in Australia, where the traditional owners, with the help of some lawyers, actually took their case to the federal courts, to the Supreme Court in fact, to claim ownership for their country. And the judge told them that, well, they didn't have any deeds of title to the land, so how could they prove they actually owned it? So off they went and they painted a series of bark paintings, some of which became petitions written on them, like the one in the photograph, and presented them to the courts. Now, they weren't successful at the time, but that actually led to the first native title legislation being passed some 14 years later. And similarly with the idea of Christianity, the artists in this community, the elders in this community, decided to paint these two, look at the size of these paintings, wonderful panels which showed the major creative beings of that whole region. And they placed them on either side of the altar in the mission church. That's what you see in the photograph up there. And again, it was this desperate attempt to try and negotiate their way through what, in fact, is, as I say, a very uncertain future. That possibly we're going to lose our language, we're going to lose our ceremonies, we're going to lose our traditions. And this is the only way that, excuse me, or the way we know best to defend it. And this mode of operation wasn't only practiced in the 60s, but right through into the 1990s, a painting like this from a totally different area up in the northwest was painted with a collaborative work by 60 artists, and it showed their country, which they were claiming back under native title. And it was used in the tribunal hearings. They rolled it out on the ground, and each tribal elder for each part of the country would stand on his clan waterhole and describe their relationship to that particular piece of country and to their neighbours. It took them 10 years, but they won the land claim. Just going back to Arnhem Land for a moment, this, as I said, this idea of culture under threat resulted in a number of strategies that artists introduced to make their work less desanctified in a sense, make it more appropriate for a public domain, remembering that these sorts of pictures were only ever painted usually in ceremonial circumstances which are closed to those who are going to be performing or participating in it. Yet, this is the dilemma. How do you do something like that, make the work appropriate to a public without lessening its integrity, cultural integrity? Because they realise, and people have said this even at the time, that if we show Europeans anything less than what we believe in, they'll think our culture is rubbish, and then we'll lose it for sure. So they wanted to produce work that had all of that cultural integrity, that could have been used in ceremony, however, was appropriate for us outsiders. And one of the devices that they introduced, and it appears in the painting by Wagner on the left, is to depict the major figures in a painting in monochrome. So in other words, they're not covered with the sacred clan designs. And they're very easy for us as outsiders to read literally as being a goanna, types of birds and fish, human beings or whatever. Now, skip forward 40 years, and this community has been incredibly active in all walks of life in Australia. We've had politicians come out of there. We've had world-renowned rock bands coming out of this community. We've had people who've stood up for the rights of Aboriginal artists. right across just about every level of society. What has happened in those 40 years, you've had a generation, 2 generations in fact, of people who have learnt how the Western world works. They have been able to incorporate it into their way of living without changing their culture. This is a place in Eastern Arnhem Land where language is still strong, ceremony is still strong. Not only is it that, they also have an annual festival called Gama, which is where they actually show outsiders what their culture is about. They're prepared to have a dialogue about their culture. And that is because they now have this security that, unlike their fathers and their grandfathers before them, that the future is now bright for them, that traditions will continue to the future. And this is reflected in the paintings that we see from the exhibition here, by the younger generation of artists like John Mowendal and Wanyubi Marika, who are going back to painting, in fact, I can put it this way, the grace of God. These paintings which are shining with spiritual light, which once upon a time would have been restricted only to ceremony. So they're confident by exposing these to a public today, they're not going to be losing any of their cultural integrity. It's a little bit like, I'm sure a lot of you have heard, of people who don't like having their photograph taken, especially First Nation people, because they feel that some of their soul is being taken away when a photograph is taken. That was the attitude in the 60s. This has all changed today, and it's reflected in the art. Now, we're going to leave the tropical area of Arnhem Land and move into the desert. As I said earlier, bark painting was regarded really as being the authentic form of Aboriginal art. So what was happening in the desert, the art of the desert, was not seen by most Australians, because in the desert people don't have a tradition of flat portable painting. They paint on their bodies, they paint on the ground, they paint on objects, but they don't paint on rectangular pieces of board or bark, primarily because the trees that you need to make a bark painting, or the bark you take the bark from, don't exist in the desert. And also, as another, again, we're going back now to early 1970s, it was a time of great uncertainty in the desert too. Here you had large groups of people being taken off literally their traditional lands, clearing their lands for the cattle industry, for mining, for bomb testing. Atomic bombs were actually tested not far from where Papunya lies today in Central Australia. And they were herded into these government settlements, which were really artificial communities. So you would have a number of different tribes, literally in a place like Papunya, having to live shoulder to shoulder when traditionally they shouldn't even be talking to each other. Places like this where the speaking of native languages was forbidden, everyone had to speak English. So they were being assimilated into Western society. And that was a government policy of the time that had been going by then for some 40 or 50 years. And then in 1971, the school teacher turns up, an art teacher at the local school, Jeff Barton, and he notices that the kids, when they draw in a figurative European way. And he said to them, well, why don't you use traditional designs like we see in the ground paintings? And they said, oh, well, we're not allowed to do that because we're too young. But if you ask the elders, they might do that for you. So he did. And what the elders, like Willie Jungarai and a number of other artists, did first off was paint a series of murals on the school walls using traditional designs. And the one you see on the right is the very first one. It's a honey ant dreaming, because the school is actually built on the the site of the ancestral honey ant. And these men really loved the idea of being able to paint on boards because suddenly, or painting these murals, because suddenly they were painting traditionally, they were painting their country, most of whom, many of these artists have been taken away from their country, so they were able to fulfil one important obligation that Aboriginal people have, and that is to care for your land. And you can do that in many ways. And one of the ways of caring for your country is to paint it. So even though many of these people were so distant, I'm talking about hundreds of miles away from their country, they reconnected to it by painting. So they asked Barton for more painting materials to keep working on keep up this connection. And what it started was, in fact, a revolution in Australian art, not just Aboriginal art, but Australian art. But the early paintings were very descriptive. They showed images of ceremony, and based on, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's that traditional sand painting with the sculptures that go with it. And again, people were quite concerned that perhaps, as in Arnhem Land in the 60s, that they were perhaps showing too much secret information to a public that knew nothing about this culture. So again, here artists devised various strategies to deal with this with the same intent, and that is to produce art that should be in the public domain, but that still protected their cultural values, but retained the integrity that they needed. And one of the devices they used was this masking or covering up, using these fields of dots to hide, if you like, conceptually hide the sacred designs, the sacred symbols. Clifford's possum painting on the left is a very good example of that. It's a picture of, in fact, a possum ancestor. There are the footprints that look like E-forms, and the circular shapes which represent the sites that this ancestor travelled to. But there's a great bushfire, and what Clifford Possum has done is used the idea of the clouds of the fire, or the smoke of the fire, covering up the tracks of the ancestor. So it's a nice conceptual device to actually say the same thing, but in fact what happens is you're actually producing something that in a sense is spiritually much more active for Aboriginal people themselves, because to create these, let's call them colour field paintings for want of a better term, is actually painting that idea of that the powers, the forces of the ancestors within the earth itself. And artists soon began taking it to extremes, like this painting by Timmy Payanka on the right, which shows a sacred site. And here, all those icons and symbols that we saw in the earlier paintings from the desert a moment ago have disappeared entirely, and you've got what, in our terms, we might think of as abstract work, but in fact it's far from abstract. I've compared this to one of Monet's Rouen Cathedral paintings. Formally, I think there are a number of similarities, a number of connections. And I noticed, Brian, that also in Crossing Cultures, you've done the same thing with some of the brochures. I think comparing works in the exhibition to other works from other cultures and other times in the collection of the museum. I think this can be very enlightening. There is obviously no connection between these two works, except for one thing. They both represent sacred places, even though the artist's intentions originally were very different. And that idea of using this sort of all-over way of painting to express really quite profound religious ideas has been taken to extremes in recent years by a number of artists in the desert. And these pictures, which you simply have to experience, there's no photograph that's ever going to do them justice. They're not op art paintings, but they're totally entrancing. You stand in front of them, you experience this amazing movement that again is, you can describe them in terms of being the surface of the earth, but they hum with this ancestral power. And again, as I say, even though, like with the bark paintings, there's models, more traditional models for bark paintings. Similarly for paintings in the desert, you find models like this. Now, in the 70s, not all desert communities were really happy with what was going on at Papunya. In the community of Yuendamu, which is only 100 miles away, not even that, the senior men there, the elders, they felt that the Papunya artists were just throwing their culture away. They didn't want to participate in this new painting movement. But they had a bit of a history in a sense, and here's where a number of American anthropologists come into play. These drawings, crayon drawings, were collected by Mervyn Meggitt, the first American anthropologist to work in this part of the desert. And he started off with asking artists to do drawings like the one on the bottom to actually help him analyse and describe sand paintings and body paintings, etc. So he gave them paper and crayons. But when you give artists paper materials to work with, you may commission them to do something, but they also do their own thing. So you ended up with a number of these artists who actually were painting images that they weren't asked to do, but they felt they needed to. So one, for example, the picture on the left by Larry Chungarai is a rendition of a ritual spearing that he witnessed as a child. And you'll notice that the one on the image on the right has been catalogued upside down. I'm showing it the right way up here, even though the number is on the wrong way, because it actually shows a European house in the community of Yuendamu. And the explanation for this painting by the artist, Willie Juppakay, when asked why is that house floating above the ground, he said, well, the main difference between white people and black people is that we black people, we live on the ground. You white people, you live above it. And that's the rendition of it there. Nonetheless, by the early 1980s, this community too started to produce work for the public domain. And again, there are various circumstances that led to this, but this, what you're looking at here, is this diptych was in fact the very first major work to leave that community. And notice the title, Toyota Dreaming. Now, there is no such thing as an ancestral story about Toyotas in the desert, but they are in fact very useful vehicles, very useful devices. And of course they cover outback Australia, four-wheel drives, that is. At any rate, a few years ago I had the privilege of curating an exhibition from the Institute of Aboriginal Studies, IATSIS, and I wanted to include these two works in that exhibition. And when I was researching them, I found out the story behind how they ended up there, but nothing about the traditional narrative that went with them. The way they ended up in the Institute's collection was that the Institute had funded another American anthropologist called Eric Michaels. Can you hear me? Yes. Is that any better? Okay. Eric Michaels saw these two paintings being produced, and the artist Paddy Sims and the other artist who painted them had intended them to send them to a commercial gallery down south. And he realised that, being the very first two major works from the community, that they really should be in public collection, not in private hands. So he decided to buy them for the Institute. The problem was, he didn't have any money. But he did have two Toyota four-wheel drive vehicles. And he swapped the cars for the paintings, and hence the title. Anyway, that was in 1983. So I've been working on this exhibition in 2004. And even though I know a lot of the symbolism that appears in these pictures, but I couldn't be very specific about it. So one of the artists, the major artist, Paddy Sims, I was privileged to be very close to in those early years. So I'd arranged for us to have a conversation on the phone. He was looking at photos of these paintings on the computer in the local art centre, and I was doing the same at home. And he's talking me through the pictures, and I'm taking notes of what they're about for the catalogue. And when he finished, he said, those Toyotas. He said, when we got those Toyotas, I could go back to my country for the first time in 40 years and perform ceremonies there. Suddenly you realise the significance of that sort of transaction. So now Aboriginal art is beginning to be seen across the world, and of course the major important exhibition here in the United States was the Dreaming Exhibition in New York in 1988, which of course influenced Will and Harvey, got them started on their wonderful mission, if you like. Within a year, the Yuendamu artists I've just spoken about, Paddy Sims and others, were commissioned to produce a work for an international exhibition in Paris called Magicians of the Earth, And there's an image of the sand painting they created, which was paired with a Richard Long mud circle. Suddenly, the art of the desert became widespread, and community after community, as you can see quite clearly in the exhibition, took up their painting on canvas and relaying traditional stories in a new medium that was adapted in various ways. But invariably, people sort of make up myths about how art is created in the desert, and I like to sort of put a stop to one of them, if you like. One of the great artists to come out of that area was Emily Kama Nwari. And she first started painting in acrylics in 1989. So by then she was into her 70s. Right? And she started to produce paintings like these that looked at home in any modern art gallery across the world. So she was touted as this overnight sensation. Here was this old Aboriginal woman who spoke no English at all, who could paint these wonderful modernist pictures. What people were forgetting was, of course, that for the previous 60 years, she'd been painting a ceremony. So for her, it was merely a change of media, but the talent was definitely there. Okay, from the deserts of the centre and the west, we're going to move up to the northwest to an area called the Kimberley. And it appears, as you can see, I hope clearly in the map, and you can see that in fact it's not very far from Darwin, which appears the top right corner of the map there. Here there was a number of art forms being practiced, but very little was actually out in the public domain. And there was one cataclysmic event that occurred on Christmas Day in 1974, which in fact had an amazing effect on the art of that region. On that day, a cyclone called Tracy, and I know you here in America have experienced some of these disasters very recently, so you'd appreciate what was going on here. There was a cyclone that destroyed the city of Darwin. The city of Darwin is very small even today, and something like 26, 27 people died, but it was a great tragedy. That cyclone went out to sea and then came back over the eastern Kimberley, and more people died as a result of floods mainly created by that cyclone. Now, for the Aboriginal people of the Kimberley, Darwin was seen as the capital of European culture, and they tried to interpret the meaning of this cyclone. Now, in the years leading up to it, there'd been a lot of cultural and social dislocation in the Kimberley. Again, Aboriginal people were being moved off their traditional lands. A lot of people in the Kimberley had worked on cattle stations, on ranches that had been set up there in the late 19th century, suddenly lost their jobs because they were forced to pay Aboriginal people wages equal to those of white people. After the referendum of 1967, when Aboriginal people were actually regarded as human beings and not classed with the flora and fauna of the country. And as a result, all these Aboriginal people in the Kimberley got the sack literally in their hundreds, and then formed townships or at least settlements on the edges of white towns. But the interpretation of the cyclone was really interesting, and that is that because cyclones are always associated, especially in this part of the world, with ancestral rainbow serpents, the elders across the country, across the Kimberley, saw the cyclone Tracy as being a rainbow serpent, destroying that centre of European culture, as a warning to Aboriginal people to keep their culture strong. And as a result, a number of ceremonies that were performed in private were suddenly being performed in public before white people. And then a number of ceremonies were instituted about the cyclone itself, which were, again, performed before white audiences. And that was, if you like, an act of cultural affirmation, to show Europeans that, yes, we still have our language, we still have our traditions, despite all of this. And in the ceremonies, people would carry boards with images that relate to the narrative being told, as in this one. But one of artists in the eastern Kimberley at the time, a man called Rover Thomas, had this dream visitation. It was a revelation, in fact, and this is about the dream that we hear about. The dreaming is not restricted to the past, it's an ongoing thing. But it was a revelation given to him by the spirit of a woman who was his auntie, who had died as a result of the floods the cyclone had created in the eastern Kimberley. And she was being flown to the west. She was in a car crash. She was fatally injured but not dead. She was taken in a flying doctor plane to the west, to Perth, where she was going to be operated on. But on the way she died. And the spirit reveals to Rover Thomas the journey that it took from the west of the Kimberley back to her home in the east. And when she gets to the east, she witnesses the rainbow serpent destroying Darwin. So this became a ceremony called the Grill, and the set of new designs that Rover Thomas had revealed to him were painted on these boards, and they show important sites on the spirit's journey. And again, so artists started painting these images for ceremony, and in time they started painting images for the public that were not necessarily to be used in ceremonies but were related to them. So for example, these are two versions of Rover Thomas's cyclone tracing. The one on the left is an image that was of the type that was used in the ceremony. In other words, it's really minimal, because if you like, the articulation of that image comes through the singing and the dancing of the ceremony itself. And then on the right you have the same subject, but it's a large canvas, and so it's not actually going to be carried around in a ceremony, but ends up in the National Gallery's collection. So in a sense it's much more articulated image of the cyclone and the winds carrying sand and dirt and dust into it, of actually the same thing. So artists like Rover, and Rover was the leading artist of this group. He in fact represented Australia as the first Aboriginal artist to represent Australia at the Venice Biennale in 1990. They went on to paint all sorts of other subjects. But I had this wonderful occasion, again making comparisons between Western art and Aboriginal, which can be enlightening to some degree but not necessarily to the nth degree. I had this wonderful experience once before Rover went to Venice in 1990, that he spent 2 weeks with us in Canberra because his agent and friend had said to me, well, he's never been to a proper museum in his life before and now he's going to Venice. So could he spend 2 weeks in Canberra at the National Gallery, which we did. And every day Rover got to see something in the collection that wasn't made by an Aboriginal artist. And of course one of the most famous paintings in the collection was Blue Poles by Jackson Pollock. And I'm sure a number of you would know it. There's a lot of controversy when it was bought in 1973 because it cost $1 million, which for Australia in those days was just totally outrageous. But anyway, Rover had heard about this painting and he wanted to see it, so I took him down to the gallery to have a look at it one afternoon, and we walked past this Rothko, not dissimilar to one in the collection here, painted a little bit earlier. And he grabs me by the shoulder and he spins me around, and I'll say it in American, not Australian, because he wouldn't understand it. What he said was, "Who's the son of a gun who paints like me?" And you can see the connections. And I was being very polite too. Rover went on to say to become an amazing artist. I mean, one of Australia's leading artists, black or white. And his repertoire of subjects really covered a broad was very broad indeed. But what he always painted was the land as carrying the scars of history, both ancestral, dreaming history, if you like, and European history. And he painted a range of emotions. So pictures on the left, which all that rain, actually is depicting a place where, as he describes it, a place where when they were young and they were working on the cattle stations, Aboriginal people would go for holidays, in other words, ceremonies. So this is a place to rejoice in. Whereas the painting on the left, on the right rather, is one showing the hidden history of Australia at the time, and that was the massacre of Aboriginal people in the early part of the 20th century. The last massacres recorded in eastern Kimberley happened around the time Rover was born, in the mid-20s. And they reveal a part of Australian history that not many people knew about because it was never taught at school. It's not in the official history books, or at least it wasn't then. I'd like to move on now to looking at art. And in fact, it's the introduction to Crossing Countries, here the way the exhibition is laid out, of artists who live in the urban regions of the country. These are the places where, that suffered the full brunt of colonialism, first and foremost, where traditions and languages have changed or been totally eradicated. But now you have a generation of artists who are trying to revive that and show their place, if you like, in the world through their art. But it really goes back to the time of settlement, to artists like the ones you see here, Tommy McRae and William Burrock, who were around in the late 19th century. And, it was a very changing world for them, obviously, and they were being commissioned by the new white settlers to make pictures of traditional life, of ceremony, of hunting, and that sort of thing. If you like, as a record of a way of life that was about to pass on. But again, once you give artists materials to work with, they can do what they wish, but in very clever ways. For example, if you look at the picture by Tommy McRae at top centre there, what appears to be a traditional bird hunt, you'll see the three hunters there. One's carrying a stick, one's carrying a boomerang, and the third one's carrying a rifle. So there you are, it's the introduction of European society into this part of the country being commented. And these things are really important because they actually give us very rare Aboriginal perspectives of what was happening in that country at the time. So for the artists or for people who lived in these urban areas around Melbourne, Sydney and places like that, most of the people were herded off into government settlements and missions. And again, they were denied access to their cultural ability to practice by and large, but of course people kept making things. But most of the art that was being produced from these settlements was regarded by mainstream Australia as being kitsch rather than art, and so people didn't look at it. Yet they had what was happening was that people were actually continuing traditional practices, the designs, even though they may not have been spoken about publicly, that appear on traditional shields from the region, like the one you see in the middle, actually reappear on things like stockware handles and things like that. So at least the traditions kept going over the generations, and we're going through the 20th century now, until we get to the 1980s, and then we have a real revolution in the cities. Excuse me. By 1987 in Sydney, we had the very first cooperative of Aboriginal artists, city-based artists, and Avril Quayle, who made this print, which is based on the Aboriginal flag, was one of the main and the chief movers in this whole cooperative movement. What these cooperatives did was they allowed Indigenous artists in the cities to have studio space. They helped them organise getting materials. They helped them organise exhibitions and sales. And so they began to be recognised at last as artists, not as makers of kitsch. And of course what happened next was that the mainstream galleries started to pick up these artists. One of the pioneers of that movement was Trevor Nichols. And you can see that in many cases the work that these artists were doing was about political situations of the time. And one of the major concerns during the 80s and into the 90s, things haven't changed greatly unfortunately, but was the number of Aboriginal deaths in custody. The percentage of Aboriginal population in Australia is something like 2.5%, and yet they're overrepresented in jails, something like 17 times that of white people. And there was a spate of supposed suicides of Aboriginal people painted through, especially in the 80s and early 90s, as I said. So artists in the cities, if you like, are starting to reinterpret the official Australian history, and often based on images like this, taking the images that actually, if you like, created the stereotypes of history in Australia and reinterpreting them. Gordon Bennett was one of the, still is, one of the leading artists in this group. And of course, photography became a very popular medium by the mid-80s. And in a sense, the whole notion of photography is very important for Aboriginal people, because what's happening here is that the camera is taken out of white hands, the white hands that photographed Aboriginal people from the days when the daguerreotype was invented, and presenting Aboriginal people as inferior, presenting Aboriginal people as poor, desolate, in the belief that was around at the time, in the late 19th, early 20th century, that the Aboriginal race was going to die out. And I particularly like, for example, people like Darren Sewer's photographs, again in the exhibition, where their images, they're self-portraits of him, half there, he's disappearing, he's sort of quite practically invisible. And it's a real reflection of Australian society, especially in the cities, where people don't even recognise that Aboriginal people live amongst them. It's as if they are truly invisible. But there's something else that's happened in the period that I've covered, the last 20 or 30 years, with the emergence of Aboriginal art in the public domain, which is truly significant. And a lot of people, especially Aboriginal people, said we were always treated as the invisible race. Once we started making art for the public, people realised we were here. And so all sorts of things happen in the cities. People continued just traditional forms and techniques, but used the new effects. And here's a woven biplane, which, as you can see, is rather large. We've been using a technique of weaving sedge grass in the south country, which is used in the south of the country. I asked Yvonne, the maker of this, how she did it. Because this thing's got no internal skeleton, yet it's wonderfully rigid. And she said, I started weaving at one end and went to the other. That was pretty competent. And also what we saw in the 80s and 90s was a revival of art from the Torres Straits up in the northwest of the country. And Torres Strait Islanders are not actually technically Aboriginal. This is why we make the distinction between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They're actually Melanesians and culturally more related to Papuans and Southern people in Papua New Guinea. But they've been part of Australia for a long time. But you have very different artistic traditions there. But the controversies that arise in the art of the deserts, of the cities rather, is perhaps one of the most polemical areas in Aboriginal art at the moment. And it has a lot to do with this idea of identity politics and racism that people still bring towards Aboriginal society in general. Richard Bell has become perhaps one of the most famous agent provocateur, if I may put it that way, artists, Indigenous artists in the country. He's actually shown a fair bit in America as well. But this is one of his early major works, and it's called Crisis, What to Do About This Half-Caste Thing. And in a sense, it begs the question, what is it that people are looking at when they're looking at Aboriginal art and Aboriginal people, Aboriginal society? Where does the notion of authenticity start and end? And Richard's been one of the artists who's questioned these, where we are at the moment. Pictures like this, which Brian knows pretty well because he was one of the judges that awarded this the National Aboriginal Art Prize in 2003, is about, the legend reads, Aboriginal art, it's a white thing. So again, Richard's questioning this whole idea of the relationship between black and white, and where would Aboriginal art be without a white audience? And the bookend to this work he painted a few years later, Australian art, it's an Aboriginal thing. We've got to the stage now in fact, a lot of white Australian artists object to this entirely because when people talk about Australian art, they're normally referring to Aboriginal art. So we've moved a long way down the road. So I'm just going to finish off with looking at a few images of where things are happening today. In Utrecht, of all places, in the Netherlands, there's a museum dedicated entirely to contemporary Aboriginal art. The Musée de Quai Branly in Paris, which opened in 2006, commissioned a number of Indigenous artists, Aboriginal artists, to make designs for the fabric of the building itself. And the image on the right that's a mock-up, hasn't been completed yet. One of those artists, Lena Nyadby, who's in the exhibition, Crossing Cultures too, has just been commissioned, or had been commissioned, to produce a design for the roof of the building. So you'll only be able to see this when it is painted. was put in place either from the Eiffel Tower or on Google Earth. And some say even if you may be able to see them from outer space, but I doubt that. Some major exhibitions that have happened recently, and Brian alluded to some of these. One was the Wilkinson collection of early paintings from Papunya, I spoke about earlier. And significantly, the exhibition made the front page, or the cover rather, of Art News magazine, which for Australia is rather significant. Then Brian mentioned Ancestral Modern in Seattle, and World of Dreams in St. Petersburg. And it's going back to 2000. Now remember I was talking about Theodore Sizer and the 1941 exhibition of Art of Australia here in America, and he decided to include Indigenous art because it was the only good art that he could find in Australia at the time, basically. So he had a strategy for showing it. Mikhail Petrovsky, the director of the Hermitage, also had a strategy for selecting this exhibition to go to the institution. In the 80s, there was a cultural exchange, or one half of a cultural exchange between the USSR and Australia. Australia received an exhibition from major works from Russian museums, and so Australia owed Russia an exhibition after the wall came down. And Petrovsky came to Australia, I suppose it must have been 96, 95 perhaps, for the first time, to see what he could do in terms of putting together a show to take back to Russia. Excuse me. And he decided on having an exhibition of contemporary Aboriginal art. And he had a strategy in mind. He wanted to bring the Hermitage into the modern world, into the contemporary world. It's great, the greatest historical museum, art historical museums in the world, but it sort of stopped early in the 20th century, and he wanted to bring it into the 21st century. And he figured that if he'd shown a contemporary European or American artist first up to try and break this nexus, that he would be criticised. So he did it subversively. He used Aboriginal contemporary artists to get him there. And within a year of putting on this exhibition, he was showing Andy Warhol and Jackson Pollock and others of that ilk. So, just to finish off with the National Gallery again, there's the first room of the gallery when it opened in October 1982. And it's a rather eclectic space. Someone described it as being the most successful postmodern space in any museum in the world at the time. There's works from pre-Columbian America, various Buddhist cultures across Asia, Australian art. The yellow painting in the middle is by Fred Williams. You have a Tiepolo and Rubens on the right, Monet on the left. But at least you have two Aboriginal bark paintings down the bottom right-hand corner, which in fact are the very first two things you saw when you entered the building. So there was some acknowledgement that at least there's something distinctive about Australia, and that was Aboriginal art. And there it was. Some years later, that's what the same room looked like. And this is the Aboriginal Memorial, which consists of 200 painted logs, which were made in the year of the bicentenary, 1988, as a statement of the survival of Aboriginal culture after 200 years of settlement. And this is what the entrance of the National Gallery looks like today. And that is the first room, in fact, of 11 galleries devoted to Aboriginal art in the building. Okay, on that very quick tour of Aboriginal art over the last 100 years, I'll leave you there and say thank you.